The city was awake, filled with the sound of moving cars and people rushing to work. Inside a tall glass building on the top floor sat Daniel Crawford in his large office. He was a man of wealth, power, and success. His company, Crawford Enterprises, was one of the biggest in the country. Daniel was going through some important papers when the phone on his desk rang. He pressed a button. "Sir," his secretary's voice came through the speaker. "There is a young man here to see you. He says it is urgent." Daniel frowned. He did not like unplanned meetings. His time was valuable, and people needed appointments to meet him. "Who is he?" Daniel asked, still looking at the document in front of him. There was a slight pause. Then his secretary said, "His name is James Carter." Daniel's pen slipped from his fingers. His body stiffened. His eyes, sharp and full of experience, lost focus for a moment. Carter. That name. It was a name he had not heard in 26 years. His heart gave a slow, heavy beat. A memory, old but not forgotten, pushed itself into his mind. A young woman with bright eyes and a warm smile. A name whispered in the quiet of his past. Lisa Carter. Daniel took a deep breath, pushing back the sudden wave of emotion. It could be a coincidence. There were many Carters in the world. But something deep inside him whispered. It was not a coincidence. He cleared his throat. "Send him in." The door opened, and a tall young man stepped inside. He was in his mid-20s with broad shoulders and a confident walk. He wore a simple but well-fitted suit, and his posture spoke of someone who knew his worth. Daniel felt his breath catch as his eyes met the young man's. Those eyes. Deep brown, serious, and filled with something familiar. Something Daniel had seen before, in Lisa. The room, though large and spacious, suddenly felt smaller. The young man, James, closed the door behind him and stood a few feet from the desk. He did not sit. He did not look nervous. Instead, he looked directly at Daniel, as if studying him. "Do you know who I am?" James asked. Daniel's fingers tightened slightly on the armrest of his chair. He was not a man who showed weakness. He had built a business empire by staying calm, by controlling his emotions. But right now, control was slipping through his fingers. Daniel leaned back, his expression unreadable. "I assume you are Lisa Carter's son." James gave a small nod. "That's right." Silence stretched between them. The air felt heavy, filled with things unsaid. Daniel's mind raced. Why was he here? What did he want? Money, answers, revenge. James broke the silence. "She never told me much about you," he said. His voice was calm but carried a sharp edge. "She didn't talk about the past, but she did tell me one thing. You made a choice. You fired her. You left." Daniel exhaled slowly. It was complicated. James let out a short, humorless laugh. "Is that what you tell yourself?" Daniel studied the young man. There was strength in him, the kind that was not born from comfort but from struggle. He had Lisa's eyes, but there was something else too. Something harder, colder, a sharpness, a fire that spoke of years spent fighting battles alone. "Why are you here?" Daniel asked. His voice was steady now, back to his usual controlled tone. James reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded photograph. He placed it on the desk and slid it toward Daniel. Daniel hesitated for a second before picking it up. The moment he saw the image, the world around him blurred. It was Lisa, younger, smiling. She was holding a baby with brown eyes just like James. Daniel felt something crack deep inside his chest. "You had a son," James said, his voice quieter now, but firm. "And you never cared to know him." Daniel placed the photograph down carefully, as if touching it too long would burn his skin. His fingers curled slightly against the desk. "You think I didn't care?" he said, his voice lower, rougher. "You think I never thought about her?" "About you?" James's jaw tightened. Thinking doesn't mean anything when you do nothing. The words hit hard. Daniel had spent years building an empire, making decisions that changed industries, controlling every aspect of his life. But here, in this moment, he had no control. He could not change the past. He could not go back to the day Lisa told him she was pregnant. He could not undo what he had done. All he had was the present. James watched him carefully, waiting. Daniel met his gaze. "What do you want?" James tilted his head slightly, as if considering his answer. "That depends," he said. "Are you going to lie to me, or are you finally going to tell the truth?" The challenge in his voice was clear. Daniel stared at the young man standing before him, the son he had never met, the son he had abandoned. And for the first time in years, he was afraid. Afraid of the truth. Afraid of what came next. Daniel's hands rested on the desk, but his mind was somewhere else. His office, which had always felt like his kingdom, now felt like a prison. He could feel the weight of James's gaze on him. The young man stood tall, waiting for an answer, but Daniel had none. His past had finally caught up with him. For years, Daniel had lived his life as if Lisa Carter never existed. It wasn't that he had forgotten her. No, that was impossible. He had simply locked the memories away, like a book pushed to the back of a shelf, never to be read again. But now, standing in front of him was proof that the past was real. Proof that his actions had consequences. James Carter, a son he had never met, a son he had never even tried to know. Daniel cleared his throat and forced himself to meet James's eyes. "I want to know more about Lisa," he said carefully. James raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "Now you do." His voice carried the same sharpness as before. "Now that she's gone." Daniel's stomach twisted. He hadn't expected this meeting. He hadn't expected this young man to walk into his office and throw his past in his face, and he certainly hadn't expected to feel this guilt. "Where is she?" Daniel asked quietly, though deep down, he already knew the answer. James studied him for a long moment. Then, in a voice that was calm but heavy, he said, "She died last year. Cancer." The words hit Daniel like a sudden wave, pulling him under. He felt his body go rigid, but he didn't look away. He had spent a lifetime pretending he didn't care. Now, he couldn't pretend anymore. His mind filled with images of Lisa, her laughter, her stubbornness, the way she used to challenge him, never afraid of his power or money. And now, she was gone. Just like that. Daniel swallowed hard. "I didn't know," he admitted. It sounded weak, even to his own ears. James's lips pressed into a tight line. "Of course you didn't. You never looked back." The silence that followed was thick, filled with unspoken words. Daniel wanted to say something, but what? That he was sorry. That he regretted it. Would that change anything? James reached into his jacket and pulled out a small folded letter. He placed it on the desk, just like he had placed the photograph earlier. "She wrote this before she died," James said. "She told me to give it to you." Daniel stared at the letter. He could already feel his heart pounding. "She didn't have to," James continued. "She had no reason to. But she did." Daniel hesitated, then slowly reached for the letter. His fingers trembled slightly as he unfolded it. The handwriting was familiar, delicate yet firm. Lisa's handwriting. "Daniel, I don't know if you ever think about me. About us. I made peace with my life, but there's something I need you to know. James is an incredible young man. He is strong, kind, and brave. He didn't need you to become that. But I did. I needed you back then, and you weren't there. I don't write this to hurt you, but to tell you that you still have a choice. You lost me, but you don't have to lose him. Make the right choice this time. Lisa." Daniel read the letter twice, 3 times. Each word cut deeper than the last. He felt the weight of the years between them. 26 years. 26 years where Lisa had raised their son alone. 26 years where she had struggled, worked, and sacrificed, without him. 26 years where he had lived his life as if none of it had happened. He looked up at James. The young man was watching him carefully, his expression unreadable. "She never asked me for anything," James said. "Not once." Daniel felt a lump in his throat. "She should have." James gave a small, bitter smile. "That's what I used to think too. But I understand now. She had pride. And she had dignity. She didn't want to beg someone who didn't want to be there." Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, breathing in deeply. "I didn't know," he said again, but the words felt empty. James shook his head. "You didn't want to know." Silence stretched between them. Daniel had spent years controlling everything in his life. He made decisions that shaped industries, built businesses, made men rich or ruined them. He was respected. He was feared. But at this moment, sitting in front of his own son, he had never felt more powerless. He looked back at the letter, his fingers tracing Lisa's name at the bottom. "Make the right choice this time." James stood up. "I didn't come here for money," he said, his voice steady. "I don't need anything from you. I just wanted to see you once, to understand the kind of man you are." Daniel looked up. "And what do you think?" James studied him for a moment before saying, "I think you're exactly what my mother said you were." Daniel swallowed. "And what was that?" James gave him a long, hard look. "A man who knows how to win everything, except the things that truly matter." Then he turned and walked toward the door. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. "James," he said, his voice rough. James stopped, but he didn't turn around. Daniel hesitated, his hands tightening into fists. He had always been good with words, always known what to say to get what he wanted. But now, no words came. He exhaled slowly. "I don't want this to be the end." James was silent for a moment. Then he turned his head slightly. "That's not up to me," he said. "It's up to you." And with that, he walked out the door. Daniel sat there, staring at the empty space where his son had stood just moments ago. For years, he had told himself he had made the right choice, that Lisa had been a mistake, that the past didn't matter. But now, for the first time, he wasn't so sure. Lisa was gone. That was something he could never change. But James was still here. And for the first time, in 26 years, Daniel Crawford wondered if it was too late to fix what had been broken. Daniel sat in his office long after James had left. The room felt different now, emptier, heavier. His eyes kept going back to the letter on his desk. Lisa's words echoed in his mind. Make the right choice this time. He had always thought of himself as a man who made the right choices. His success was proof of that. Every decision, every step had led him to this place. Powerful, respected, wealthy. But for the first time, he wondered if he had been wrong. He reached for the letter again, his fingers pressing against the paper, as if holding it tighter could bring Lisa back. But she was gone. He would never get the chance to look into her eyes again, never get the chance to explain. A soft knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. His secretary peeked inside. "Sir, is everything all right?" Daniel straightened, pushing away his emotions. "I'm fine," he said. His voice was calm, controlled, just as it had always been. The secretary hesitated, then nodded. "You have another meeting in 10 minutes. Should I send them in?" Daniel shook his head. "Cancel it." She blinked in surprise. He never canceled meetings, but she didn't ask any questions. "Of course, sir." As the door closed, Daniel let out a slow breath. His mind was still racing. He had spent the last 26 years pretending Lisa and her child didn't exist. And now, in just a few minutes, James had torn through that illusion like it was nothing. His son. The words felt foreign, like they belonged to someone else. He reached for his phone before he could stop himself. His fingers hovered over the screen. He wanted to call someone. But who? Lisa was gone. James had walked out. And Daniel had never let anyone close enough to trust. He put the phone down. He needed time to think. For the rest of the day, he couldn't focus. Numbers, reports, contracts, none of it seemed to matter. His mind kept pulling him back, making him relive that moment when James stood in front of him, waiting for answers. And then, just as he was about to leave for the night, his phone buzzed. A message. He picked it up, expecting it to be from his assistant. But when he saw the name on the screen, his breath caught. James Carter. It was just one sentence, but it was a sentence that changed everything. Do you even regret it? Daniel stared at the words, his fingers tightening around the phone. Did he regret it? He had never allowed himself to ask that question. He had buried it under work, success, and power. But now, looking at the message, he realized something terrifying. He didn't know the answer. And for the first time in his life, he was afraid of what that meant. Daniel couldn't sleep that night. He kept replaying the message in his head over and over again. Regret. A word he had never associated with himself. He had made mistakes, of course, but regret. That was for people who had lost control. But now, as he lay in his dark, silent bedroom, he felt it creeping in. Lisa. He had been so sure back then. So sure that cutting ties was the best thing to do. She had meant something to him once, maybe even more than he admitted. But when she told him she was pregnant, fear had taken over. He was young, ambitious. He had plans. A child didn't fit into those plans. So, he had made his choice. He fired her, walked away, and never looked back. Until now. The next morning, Daniel did something he hadn't done in years. He got into his car and drove, without a destination, without a plan. He just needed air, space to think. His hands gripped the wheel tighter than usual as he passed through the busy streets of the city. Then, before he knew it, he was there. An old neighborhood, a small house with a white fence. Lisa's house. His heart pounded as he stared at it. He hadn't been here in over 2 decades. Everything looked different, yet somehow exactly the same. He didn't know what he was expecting. Maybe some part of him thought James would be there. Maybe some part of him wanted to see Lisa's face one last time, even if only in a memory. But the house was silent. He sat there for a long time before finally pulling away. His phone buzzed again. James. Another message. I didn't expect an answer. I just wanted to know if you feel anything at all. Daniel's chest tightened. He wanted to say something. He wanted to tell James he did feel something. But he didn't know how. And before he could find the words, another message came. Because if you don't, then this is the last time we speak. Daniel closed his eyes. It wasn't a threat. It was a choice. And for the first time, Daniel Crawford realized that no amount of money, power, or control could undo the past. He had to make a decision that could change everything. Daniel had never been a man to hesitate. He built an empire by making quick decisions, by knowing exactly what to do in every situation. But now, for the first time in his life, he didn't know what to do. James's last message sat on his phone screen like a challenge. Because if you don't, then this is the last time we speak. Daniel stared at those words, feeling something he didn't quite understand. Loss. For years, he had convinced himself that Lisa and the child she carried didn't matter. He had told himself that walking away had been the right thing. But now, that child, his son, was giving him one last chance, and he had no idea how to take it. His fingers hovered over the screen. He could type something, anything. He could tell James that he did feel something, that he wasn't as heartless as he seemed. But James wouldn't believe words. Not after 26 years of silence. Daniel clenched his jaw. He had made a life out of fixing problems, but this wasn't a business deal. He couldn't just write a check and expect things to be fine. This was different. And then, as if the universe itself was pushing him forward, his phone rang. He looked down. Unknown number. Normally, he ignored calls like this, but something made him answer. Hello. There was a short silence. Then a soft, hesitant voice spoke. "Mr. Crawford?" "A woman." "Yes," he said cautiously. "Who is this?" "My name is Margaret. I was Lisa's friend and her lawyer." Daniel's heartbeat slowed. "Her lawyer?" "Yes," Margaret said. "She left something for you." Daniel stiffened. "For me?" "Yes," she repeated. "It's a letter." A cold feeling passed through him. A letter. Margaret sighed. "She wrote it a few months before she passed. She told me to give it to you if James ever made contact. I think she knew this moment would come." Daniel gripped the phone tighter. Lisa had written him a letter. She had known. Somehow, she had known that James would come looking for him. His throat felt dry. "Where can I meet you?" Margaret hesitated. "Are you sure you want to read it?" The question caught him off guard. "Why wouldn't I?" There was a pause before she answered. "Because once you do, you won't be able to ignore the past anymore." Daniel exhaled. "Just tell me where." Margaret gave him an address. An hour later, Daniel sat across from Margaret in a quiet cafe. She was an older woman with kind but sharp eyes. She studied him like she was trying to understand something. "You look exactly how she described you," she said. Daniel tensed. "And how did she describe me?" Margaret gave a small, sad smile. "As a man who had everything, but nothing at all." Daniel's chest tightened. He didn't respond. Margaret reached into her bag and pulled out a white envelope. She slid it across the table. "She wrote this for you," she said softly. "No one else has read it." Daniel stared at the envelope. His name was written on the front in Lisa's familiar handwriting. Slowly, he picked it up. He wasn't sure if he was ready, but he opened it anyway. "Daniel, I never thought I would write this letter, and I never thought you would read it. But life is strange, isn't it? By the time you read this, I will be gone, and maybe, for the first time in your life, you will have to face the truth. I never hated you, Daniel. I want you to know that. I was angry. I was hurt. I was alone. But I never hated you. I just wanted you to love him. James. He was the best thing that ever happened to me. And yes, I struggled. Yes, there were nights when I was afraid, when I didn't know how I would make it. But I never regretted having him. Because he was worth it. He still is. But you never gave yourself the chance to see that. You ran. And for years, I told myself that I didn't care, that we didn't need you. But the truth is, I wanted you to come back. Not for me. For him. You had a son, Daniel, and you left him. I won't tell you that it's too late. That's not for me to decide. But if you're reading this, then I know one thing, you still have a choice. I just hope, this time, you make the right one. Lisa. Daniel's hand shook as he lowered the letter. For a long time, he just sat there, staring at it. Lisa had never reached out to him, never begged him to come back. But she had wanted him to. And now, even in death, she was giving him a chance. Margaret watched him carefully. She loved you, you know. Daniel let out a slow breath. She shouldn't have. Margaret gave him a small smile. Maybe not. But she did. Daniel stared at the letter again. A son. A life he had missed. And now, a choice. James had given him one last chance. Daniel clenched the letter in his fist. This time, he wouldn't run. This time, he would face the truth. Because for the first time in 26 years, he wanted to. And that changed everything. Daniel had never felt this kind of weight in his chest before. It was strange. A man like him. Someone who had built an empire from nothing, who had stood in boardrooms making decisions worth millions, shouldn't feel this. Helpless. But as he sat alone in his car, gripping the letter Lisa had left behind, he felt exactly that. Helpless. Because no amount of power, no amount of wealth, could change the past. He had made his choices. And now, after 26 years, he was finally facing the cost. Lisa had given him a chance to do the right thing. But was it too late? Would James even listen to him? Would he even care? Daniel took a deep breath and reached for his phone. His hands felt unsteady as he typed a message. James, I need to see you. Please. He stared at the screen for a long time before pressing send. And then he waited. Minutes passed, then an hour. No reply. Daniel's stomach twisted. He couldn't blame him. If he were in James's place, he wouldn't reply either. Still, the silence hurt in a way he wasn't prepared for. He had spent years pretending James didn't exist. But now, knowing he might never get a response, it made something inside him ache. Lisa's words echoed in his mind. I just hope, this time, you make the right choice. He wasn't sure what the right choice was. But for the first time, he knew he had to try. The next day, Daniel did something he never imagined himself doing. He went to James's office. It wasn't hard to find out where he worked. A few phone calls, a little research, and he had the address. As he walked into the building, people turned to look at him. They knew who he was. Daniel Crawford, billionaire, CEO, a man whose name was spoken with both admiration and fear in the business world. But right now, he wasn't a powerful businessman. He was just a father looking for his son. He reached the receptionist's desk. I'm here to see James Carter, he said. The receptionist gave him a curious look. Do you have an appointment? No, Daniel admitted. But I need to see him. She hesitated. I'm sorry, sir. He's busy. Daniel nodded, expecting the answer. But he wasn't leaving. Tell him Daniel Crawford is here, he said. Tell him I'll wait. The receptionist frowned but made the call. Daniel waited. 5 minutes. 10. 15. Then, finally. He said, you have 5 minutes, the receptionist said. Conference room down the hall. Daniel nodded and walked toward the room, his heartbeat quickening with every step. When he stepped inside, James was already there. His son. James sat at the long table, his arms crossed. His expression was unreadable. Daniel hesitated before sitting down across from him. For a moment, there was only silence. Then James spoke. Why are you here? His voice was calm, but Daniel could hear the anger underneath. I read Lisa's letter, Daniel said quietly. Something flashed in James's eyes, but he didn't say anything. Daniel swallowed. She wanted me to know the truth. About you. About what I lost. James let out a short, bitter laugh. Now you care. Daniel flinched. He had expected this. He had deserved this. I don't know what I expect, Daniel admitted. I don't even know if I have the right to be here. You don't, James said coldly. Daniel nodded slowly. Silence filled the room again. James's jaw tightened. Do you even know what it was like for her, raising me alone? Daniel looked down. No. You never wondered. Daniel let out a slow breath. I told myself you didn't exist. James's hands curled into fists. And now, what changed? Daniel met his eyes. I did. James stared at him, his expression unreadable. You think one conversation can fix 26 years? He asked. No, Daniel said, but maybe it's a start. James exhaled, shaking his head. You walked away from her, he said. You left her when she needed you the most. And now, after all these years, you just show up. Daniel's chest tightened. I know I can't change the past, he said, and I won't insult you by pretending I deserve anything from you, but I had to come. James's eyes darkened. Why? Because I regret it, Daniel said. Because I should have been there. Because I should have been your father. The words felt heavy, raw. James clenched his jaw, looking away. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then James let out a shaky breath. She used to say you weren't a bad man. Daniel swallowed. She was wrong. James gave a small, bitter smile. She believed in second chances. I don't. Daniel felt his stomach drop. So this was it. He had tried. But it wasn't enough. James stood up. I have work to do. Daniel nodded and stood as well. As James turned to leave, Daniel's voice stopped him. Lisa wanted me to choose differently this time, he said quietly. And I have. I'm not walking away. James froze. Daniel took a slow breath. I know I can't force you to care, he said, but I want to know you, even if it's just a little. James didn't turn around. Then, after a long pause, he spoke. I don't know if I can forgive you, he admitted. Daniel's throat tightened. I don't expect you to, he said, but I'll wait. James said nothing. Then, without another word, he walked out. Daniel stood there, his chest heavy, his heart pounding. He had taken the first step. But was it too late? He didn't know. All he knew was that this time, he wouldn't run. This time, he would stay. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. Daniel had spent his life fixing problems. He had built his company from the ground up, made difficult decisions, and taken risks no one else would. He knew how to win. But this wasn't something he could win. This was something he had to earn. And for the first time, he didn't know how. After his meeting with James, Daniel had expected to feel relief. He had finally faced his son, spoken the truth, admitted his regrets. But instead, he felt something worse. An emptiness. James had given him nothing. No promise, no hope, not even the slightest hint that things could change. And yet Daniel had told him he wouldn't walk away. So what now? What did staying actually mean? For a man who had never been a father, it was the hardest question of all. Days passed. Then a week. James didn't call. He didn't text. Daniel thought about reaching out but stopped himself every time. James had spent 26 years without him. One conversation wasn't going to undo all of that. But that didn't mean Daniel had to disappear. So he started small. He researched James's work. He already knew his son was brilliant, a financial strategist working for one of the top firms in the city. And then he showed up. Not at his office, not in his personal space, but at his public lectures. James occasionally gave talks about the financial market, speaking to young professionals about business growth and smart investments. Daniel sat at the back, listening. He wasn't surprised by how sharp, confident, and respected James was, but he was surprised by how proud it made him feel. This was his son, a man he had never raised, never guided, but still, somehow, James had become incredible, and Daniel had missed all of it. When the talk ended, Daniel didn't approach him. He simply left. But the next time James gave a lecture, Daniel was there again. And the next time. And the next. For 3 weeks, he simply watched, showing up without saying a word. Until finally, James noticed. It was after one of the talks, when James was stepping off stage, that their eyes met. Daniel was standing near the exit, his expression calm but steady. For a second, James looked like he might ignore him. Then, with a sigh, he walked over. "You keep showing up," he said. Daniel nodded. "I told you, I won't walk away again." James studied him for a moment. "You think this changes anything?" he asked. Daniel exhaled. "I don't know, but it's a start." James crossed his arms. "Why now?" Daniel hesitated. "Because I didn't know what I lost until it was too late," he admitted, "and I don't want to spend the rest of my life pretending I don't care." James's jaw tightened. Silence stretched between them. Then, finally, James spoke. "I don't trust you," he said. Daniel swallowed. "I understand." James sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Look, I don't know what you expect from me," he said. "You can't just walk in and act like a father." Daniel nodded. "I don't expect to. I just want to get to know you." James stared at him, conflict in his eyes. Then, after a long pause, he said something Daniel never expected. There's a diner across the street. Daniel's breath caught. James shifted uncomfortably. If you're serious about trying, have coffee with me. Daniel's chest tightened. This wasn't forgiveness, but it was something. And for now, that was enough. The diner was small, quiet. James sat across from him, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. The waitress came, took their orders, then left them in silence. Daniel hesitated before speaking. Your mother loved this kind of place, he said quietly. James's eyes flickered with something unreadable. You knew that? Daniel gave a small smile. I knew a lot about her. His voice softened. But I never knew enough. James looked down, his fingers tapping against the table. You said you regret leaving, he said. I do, Daniel admitted. James exhaled. Then tell me why you did it. Daniel's chest tightened. This was it. The moment that could make or break everything. He could lie. He could make excuses. But for once in his life, he didn't want to. So he told the truth. I was afraid, he said simply. James frowned. Of what? Daniel let out a slow breath. Of being a father, he admitted. Of failing. Of ruining your life before it even started. James stared at him. Daniel shook his head. I was young, selfish, and I thought walking away was the best choice. I told myself, Lisa, and you would be better off without me. He swallowed hard. But I was wrong. James's hands curled into fists. She struggled, he said. She cried herself to sleep worrying about me. You think we were better off? Daniel closed his eyes for a brief second. No, he said quietly. I don't. James exhaled, shaking his head. You had years to change your mind, he said. Why now? Daniel hesitated. Because when I read Lisa's letter, he said, I realized she never gave up on me. She believed I could be better, even when I didn't deserve it. James looked away. The waitress returned with their coffee, placing the cups in front of them. Neither of them touched it. Daniel took a deep breath. I don't expect forgiveness, he said, and I don't expect to be your father. But if there's even a small chance we can move forward, I want to take it. James stared at the coffee cup, his expression unreadable. Then finally, he sighed. I don't know if I can forgive you, he admitted. Daniel nodded. But, James hesitated. Maybe we can try. Daniel felt something in his chest loosen. Not relief. Not victory. But hope. And for now, that was enough. The cemetery was quiet. A soft breeze moved through the trees, carrying the scent of fresh earth and fallen leaves. The sky was a dull gray, and the air felt heavy, as if the world itself understood the weight of this moment. Daniel stood still, his hands in the pockets of his coat, his eyes fixed on the name carved into the headstone. Lisa Carter. It had been 26 years since he had last seen her, and now, all he had left of her were memories and regrets. James stood beside him, silent. His face was calm, but his hands were clenched into fists. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then James exhaled. She used to come here every Sunday, he said quietly. She talked to you. Daniel turned to him, confused. James's jaw tightened. She never stopped thinking about you, he said. Even when she was angry, even when she was hurt, she still talked to you. Daniel felt something sharp in his chest. He had spent years pretending Lisa didn't exist, but she had never stopped remembering him. Slowly, Daniel knelt in front of the grave. His fingers brushed over the letters of her name, and his throat tightened. I'm sorry, he whispered. The wind carried his words away, but he hoped, somehow, that she heard him. He had never said those words to her before, and now it was too late. His eyes stung, and for the first time in years, he felt the ache of loss in a way he couldn't control. He had lost Lisa before he even realized what she had meant to him, and now he had one last chance, not with her, but with their son. Daniel took a shaky breath and turned to James. I know I can never make it right, he said, "but I don't want to waste whatever time I have left." James looked at him, his expression unreadable. Then, finally, he gave a small nod. "Neither do I," he admitted. Daniel's chest tightened, but this time it wasn't pain. It was hope. They left the cemetery together. For the first time, they weren't just two strangers connected by the past. They were two men trying to build something new. James didn't say much, but as they walked to the car, he glanced at Daniel. "Are you hungry?" he asked. Daniel raised an eyebrow. James shrugged. "There's a diner not far from here." Daniel felt a small smile tug at his lips. Lisa would have loved this. "Yeah," he said. "Let's go." And for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt like he wasn't walking alone. He had spent years running from his past, but now he was finally walking toward his future. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late after all.